Hey, it's Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch Network, and I have a really fun piece for you today if your idea of fun is horrifying, disgusting, and distasteful. In just the past couple of weeks, there have been 3 separate instances of such unfathomable corruption that any other normal presidency wouldn't have survived a single one of them, let alone all 3. Confirmed insider trading, not by someone in the administration, but by the sitting president of the United States. A literal slush fund to help criminals who are allied with this administration, and a finance scheme so monumental that it has the potential to set up Donald Trump and his family as one of the wealthiest dynasties in the world. And that is not an exaggeration. Now, thankfully, it's a slow data release week, so we have time to really sit with this stuff and let it settle in, because this corruption is so profound that historians will be writing books about this period for decades to come. The problem is, we're living through it in real time, which means we've almost lost a sense of scale. So before I get to what's happening right now, I want to walk through what a real scandal used to look like, what it used to take to bring down an administration, and to see how far we've fallen from that standard. Teapot Dome. In the 1920s, Warren G. Harding is president, and he's about to be hit with a scandal so significant that for the better part of a century, it was considered the single greatest act of government corruption in American history. And here's how it all went down. The U.S. government had set aside oil reserves in California and Wyoming specifically for the U.S. Navy, strategic petroleum holdings that were not for sale, not for lease, and not for the private market. Now, in Wyoming, one of those reserves sat beneath a rock formation that looked vaguely like a teapot, so you can see where this is going. A man named Albert Fall was Harding's Secretary of the Interior in 1921, and he maneuvered to have oversight of those naval reserves transferred from the Navy Department to the Interior Department. Then, he quietly leased the Teapot Dome Reserve to oil tycoon Harry Sinclair and the Elks Hills Reserve in California to Edward Doheny without any competitive bidding, any public disclosure, or congressional approval. In exchange, Fall received up to $400,000 in bribes, cash delivered in a black bag, Liberty bonds, and livestock for his New Mexico ranch. Bob Menendez would be proud. When Senate investigators started pulling some threads in 1924, the whole thing unraveled. Fall resigned. The leases were canceled by the Supreme Court, which declared them fraudulent and called Fall a faithless public officer. Criminal trials followed, and he was eventually convicted of bribery, becoming the first sitting cabinet member in American history to go to prison for crimes committed in office. And that's how it's done, Merrick Garland. Harding, having died before the full scope of the scandal was known, was spared the final reckoning. Now, the legacy of this all is that Teapot Dome produced a landmark Supreme Court ruling affirming Congress's subpoena power in investigations, and it defined the outer boundary of executive corruption for a generation. 50 years later, we got something even bigger, and this time, the guy at the top did catch heat. June 17, 1972. 5 men are arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Now, they're there to photograph documents and plant listening devices, and they work, directly or indirectly, for the committee to re-elect the president, who was obviously Richard Nixon. And they were turned in, as we now know, by none other than Forrest Gump. Now, the burglary itself was almost comically unnecessary because Nixon was way ahead in the polls and likely to win in a landslide, which he did. But paranoia is its own logic, and the cover-up that followed the arrest was where Nixon wound up destroying himself. So hush money was paid to the burglars, FBI investigations were obstructed, Nixon's own White House counsel, John Dean, told him directly that there was a cancer on the presidency, and all of it was recorded by his own secret taping system, including the smoking gun conversation in which Nixon ordered the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. Now, that tape, revealed 2 years after the break-in, was what ultimately ended his presidency. So Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the only American president in history to do so. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do that again? Now, Gerald Ford delivered this summary. Our long national nightmare is over. And then he went on to pardon Nixon, which became a whole thing. But here's the corollary to our current situation. Nixon didn't just authorize a break-in. His administration was a catalog of abuses: illegal use of military force, domestic spying, outright bribery, campaign contributions laundered through shell companies, the weaponization of the IRS against political enemies, and in one specific act of executive overreach, withholding congressionally appropriated funds for programs that he personally opposed, a practice called impoundment. Now, Nixon forced Congress to pass a law specifically to stop him: the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support over Nixon's veto, and it established the Congressional Budget Office, and it required congressional approval before any president could rescind appropriated funds. And the reason this matters greatly today is because Russell Vought, perhaps the most capable and dangerous person in this entire administration, is the one who orchestrated the theft of government funding to almost every agency in 2025, essentially flouting the Impoundment Act. And this is a very, very big deal. In fact, before we move on to another huge scandal in our little history lesson, let's hang here for a second. I want you to listen to him arguing with Congress over this specific concept.
Given the law of this land, do you still believe in impoundments?
200 years of presidents had the ability to spend less money
Once again,
than Congress
Director,
provided.
do you believe in impoundments?
Of course I believe in impoundments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
The Supreme Court has never spoken on this issue, by the way. All of what you said is largely not true and heavily new.
In regards to Train versus City of New York.
No, that's not true. It was
they
not on
struck that
impoundment.
down.
It was a textual issue.
And isn't it true that Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution clearly gives Congress the power of the purse?
To set the limit.
Isn't that correct?
To set the limit on what an appropriation should be.
And despite all this, you still believe in impoundments,
We believe
correct?
vitally in the Constitution's ability to make sure that we can't spend a dollar that you haven't appropriated.
So what he's saying here is that Congress can set the appropriations amount, but it can't direct the funds. Now, that's one interpretation, but it's false. But because we live in the Roberts Supreme Court, this isn't going to be considered anytime soon. So this is Russell Vought's MO. And if you don't recognize his name, he's the guy that wrote Project 2025. So he knows that with control of all three branches, he can just break norms and protocols and even laws to fuel his white Christian nationalist agenda. And that's why we nicknamed him Rasputin. This is the guy in the president's ear. Donald Trump is way too inept and way too distracted to pull any of this off. And Vought is moving very quickly and deliberately to tear down as much as he can, like USAID, Department of Education, Interior, Energy, EPA. All of these cuts that you see and the kneecapping of authority is this guy's design. And in the first year, he did it all by ignoring the biggest thing that came out of the Nixon administration scandals. So now back to Nixon. In the end, Watergate produced more good government reforms than any single event in American history. We got the War Powers Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Inspector General Act, Civil Service Protections, campaign finance reform, and impoundment. And it gave us, of course, a suffix. Every scandal since this time has been appended with "gate" to signal the depth of the wrongdoing. Monica-gate, Deflate-gate. The suffix is so ubiquitous that we've almost forgotten why it exists. Now, this brings us to the late 1980s, and a scandal that revealed something even more troubling than personal corruption: a secret government operating inside the official one, which is also chillingly familiar in today's world. In the early to mid-1980s, Congress passed a series of amendments referred to as the Boland Amendments to curtail U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, and they were specifically designed to prohibit U.S. government funding of the Contras, the anti-Sandinista rebels in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration disagreed with it. So rather than work through Democratic channels to change it, senior officials just ignored it. So under the scheme, U.S. officials would sell arms to Iran, which was specifically under an arms embargo at the time because of the Iran hostage situation, and then use the proceeds to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, the operation was run out of the National Security Council by a Marine lieutenant colonel named Oliver North. And Ollie North kept meticulous notebooks documenting every step of the scheme. But when a Lebanese magazine named Ash-Shara broke the story in November of 1986, the whole covert architecture collapsed in public view. So Reagan goes on live television and says, "We did not sell arms to the Iranians to fund the Contras." You know, just like Bill Clinton went on live television and said, "I did not have sexual relations with that girl." You know, just like Trump went on television and said, "I don't even know Jeffrey Epstein." Anyway, 4 months later, he had to go back on TV and walk it all back, saying that, yeah, we did it. It was just an operation that deteriorated. The other thing that deteriorated was his approval ratings, because he suffered the largest single-month drop of any American president in history. He went from 67% to 46%. And this was back when, presidents cared about things like approval. So the fallout was that Reagan appointed the Tower Commission to investigate everything, and an independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, spent nearly 7 years on the case. He secured a dozen indictments, 8 convictions or guilty pleas, and among the convictions was Ollie North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger was indicted, but most of the convictions were later overturned on appeal or pardoned by George H.W. Bush in his final day in office, which Walsh suggested was partly designed to prevent Bush from being implicated. Now, in the end, no one went to prison, but this scandal cracked something open about how American foreign policy actually worked. Covert operations, off-the-books funding, a shadow government running foreign wars without congressional knowledge. So the public's trust in the presidency, which was already damaged by Vietnam and Watergate, just dropped another floor. So the legacy of this is that the Iran-Contra affair revealed that the guardrails of democratic oversight could be routed around if the executive branch was determined enough. So now look, these were all legitimate scandals, historic ones that we study in school. Now let's talk about what happened in just a matter of weeks in this Trump administration to give you an idea of the speed, the scale, and the brazenness of what's unfolding.
According to the filings, the president's been trading some intel in the quarter. Yeah.
Trade.
You got nothing to say about it?
Yeah.
That's loony bird Jim Cramer from CNBC having what journalist Ryan Grimm correctly identified as the normal reaction to Trump actively insider trading on his own decisions. 10 seconds of just mumbling incoherently on live television. But let me explain why. In mid-May, Trump filed a mandatory ethics disclosure covering his stock trades for the first quarter of 2026, just January through March. And it was extraordinary. Get this, 3,700 individual stock transactions with the total value of somewhere between $220 million and $750 million. So more that they have to do it in ranges. They don't give specifics. So more than 30 individual purchases were worth $1 million or more in a single quarter, each one of them. So the companies were NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Broadcom, Goldman Sachs, Alphabet, AMD, Intel, Micron. And here's where it gets interesting. The executives of nearly every single one of these companies went with Trump to Beijing in the week before the disclosures came out. The president was on Air Force One with the CEOs of the companies that he just bought millions of dollars of stock in. But here's what made Cramer stumble. Trump toured a Thermo Fisher scientific manufacturing facility, and on the same day, he purchased tens of thousands of dollars in Thermo Fisher stock. And then he gave a speech calling Apple a great company and praising Tim Cook by name, and he got it right this time. The same day, he purchased hundreds of thousands of dollars in Apple stock. Trump gave a Fox News interview in which he described Micron Technology as one of the hottest companies, and a day later, he purchased Micron stock. Trump gave a speech in Georgia and told the audience directly, go out and buy a Dell computer, and 9 days later, he purchased millions of dollars in Dell stock. So let me be precise about the structure here. The President of the United States has a trust that holds his assets, but that trust isn't managed by an independent blind trustee as every other ethics norm and presidential tradition requires. It's managed by Donald Trump Jr. There's no legal or physical barrier preventing Trump from communicating with his son about what to buy and when. Now layer in prediction markets. Bubble Maps, a data analytics firm, identified 9 anonymous accounts on Polymarket and Kalshi, the betting platforms. They placed more than 80 bets on U.S. military actions, the timing of the bombardments, ceasefire announcements, geopolitical events, and their win rate was 98%, with total winnings over $2.4 million. One account called MAGA My Man made $550,000 betting on the death of Iran's supreme leader. An active-duty Army Master Sergeant was indicted in April for using a VPN to place a $34,000 bet on the capture of Nicolas Maduro, a bet that paid out $400,000. The White House itself wound up sending a memo to staff in March saying, don't use non-public government information to bet on prediction markets because it's a federal crime. And they sent the memo because it was happening all over the place. And unsurprisingly, Donald Trump Jr. is an investor in Polymarket through his venture capital firm 1789 Capital. Now, no charges have been filed. Nothing's been proven in a court of law, but Rep. Dan Goldman put it pretty plainly. This smells like blatant and criminal insider trading. Now remember, in the Teapot Dome scandal, it took 2 years of Senate investigation just to establish that Albert Fall had accepted a bribe. The mechanics of accountability move very slowly, but the pattern here isn't exactly subtle. The president buys stock, the president makes a public statement that moves said stock, and the president profits. Over and over and over again, more than 3,700 times in 90 days. But wait, there's more. On the same day that the stock trading disclosures were generating headlines, the Trump Justice Department quietly announced something else. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who before taking the job was Donald Trump's personal defense attorney, unveiled what they call the Anti-Weaponization Fund totaling $1.776 billion to be drawn from the Treasury Department's Judgment Fund and for the stated purpose of compensating people who they claim were unfairly targeted by the Biden administration's Justice Department. Now let's walk through how this money is created because the mechanism is just as important as the account. Trump filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS. His IRS, the one that reports to his Treasury Secretary over the leak of his personal tax returns. And a federal judge has already cast doubt on the basic legality of a sitting president suing a department that he controls. But before any ruling came down, the Justice Department settled the case against itself. And the $10 billion lawsuit became $1.776 billion, a fund controlled entirely by Blanche, mind you, Trump's former personal attorney, to pay out his allies, payable by the Treasury, which is also his. So Jamie Raskin didn't mince words on this. He said no president can concoct a fake case for $10 billion in damages against the government so he can be plaintiff and defendant, then settle the bogus claim against himself as the judge. It's a racket. Senator Ron Wyden called it the most brazen theft and abuse of taxpayer dollars by any president in American history. But here's where it gets a little worse. The money doesn't go to Trump directly. At least we don't think so. It goes into a fund controlled by a 5-member commission, and those 5 members are handpicked by Todd Blanche. The recipients of the payouts aren't going to be made public, nor will the amounts, apparently. Process is entirely internal to an administration that has already demonstrated that it will use every lever of government for political purposes. And who exactly are the beneficiaries of these grand payouts that won't be disclosed? Well, supposedly it's Jan 6ers, militia members, Proud Boys. Actually, we don't know. And what happened when this was announced? The Treasury's own general counsel, Brian Morrissey, a former clerk for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, resigned. Yeah, a man who worked for Clarence Thomas decided that even this was a bridge too far. And then there's this, an update to a story that we did on Meidas and UNFTR jointly a year ago.
Our job is not to advance a pro-industry crypto bill that will grease the skids for the President of the United States crypto grift while tens of millions of Americans can't afford the basics.
Last year, we connected the dots on the Trump family's World Liberty financial stablecoin gambit that sets the family up to be one of the wealthiest families on the planet. Now, for this to happen, 3 distinct bills have to clear Congress: the Genius Act, the Clarity Act, and the Anti-CBDC Surveillance Act. Now, together, these bills would allow the Trump family to possess one of the only authorized mechanisms to purchase U.S. treasuries on the blockchain. The Genius Act, which in and of itself is not a bad piece of legislation, is already law. But it's the next two that, in tandem, weaponize the Genius Act and set the Trump family up for life. Well, last week, the Clarity Act cleared an important milestone by being passed by the Senate Banking Committee and the Digital Assets Subcommittee on May 14th in a 15-9 vote. Now, every Republican obviously voted yes, but 2 Democrats crossed over. No Democratic amendments were adopted, not on ethics, anti-money laundering, consumer protection, none of them. They were all rejected or ruled out of order by Senator Tim Scott, who chairs the committee. Now, here's what this bill does and who it benefits. The Trump family, through an entity called World Liberty Financial, issues a stablecoin called USD1. It's in existence. They reportedly pocketed $57 million on the launch alone, and then secured over $2 billion in institutional deals, including one with an Abu Dhabi sovereign wealth fund. So the Clarity Act creates a regulatory framework that legitimizes their coin, protects their market position, and hands the oversight of the entire stablecoin industry to the CFTC. It's a smaller, more industry-friendly regulator than the SEC. It's also the regulator that took control of the derivatives market after we did this the first time, and it led to the housing crisis because they don't have the wherewithal, the bandwidth, or the staff to be able to oversee these complex investments. So this is very much on purpose. Meanwhile, that third bill that's waiting in the wings, the Anti-CBDC Surveillance Act bill, would, after the Clarity Act changes the governance of all these tokens, specifically prohibit the Federal Reserve, our own government, from issuing a retail stablecoin for use in the marketplace. So just to give you an idea of the potential profit here, Tether, which is the world's largest stablecoin issuer, earned over $10 billion in profit last year alone, just on reserve income. Circle, which is in second place, is on pace to earn nearly $3 billion this year based on their first quarter disclosures. And these numbers are going to look small in a decade. So the Trump family's USD1 is very well positioned to capture an ever-growing share of that market in perpetuity. Because since the Trump family launched their USD1, it's already doubled in market cap, and it currently sits as the world's 4th largest stablecoin by issuance and volume. Now, I should say that for all of Elizabeth Warren's very courageous and very clear-headed objections to all of this, the Democrats aren't necessarily totally aligned with her. For example, one Democrat on the Senate Banking Committee who crossed over to advance this bill out of committee was Ruben Gallego of Arizona, who received approximately $10 million in crypto industry support for his 2024 Senate race, and was then subsequently named the ranking Democrat on the Digital Assets Subcommittee. Yeah, that one. Teapot Dome was one transaction, one bribed official, one cabinet secretary. This is a sitting president using the legislative process to build a private empire with no ethics provisions, no guardrails on his personal conflicts, and seemingly only one senator fighting it. 3 scandals, 3 weeks. Any one of them in a previous era of American governance would have ended a presidency hard stop. Together, they represent something that I don't think we have adequate language for, because the words don't exist yet, because we've never needed them to describe this scale of corruption. Historians are going to have a lot to write about, so our job is to make sure that the story doesn't get lost in the noise while it's still happening. My name is Max from UNFTR. You can find me on YouTube and Blue Sky at UNFTR, and make sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter at UNFTR.com. I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.